The truth about WrestleMania 13 was we didn't really have any idea what we were doing. The whole match with Steve at WrestleMania 13, I'll just say this much about it, is that I was totally dragging my feet, going, not that I, no disrespect to Steve, but I didn't see any point in wrestling Steve Austin at WrestleMania. I thought it was a throw-together match.
There was a time when being a WWE hero meant something very simple. You respected the fans, followed the rules, shook hands, and fought with honor. For years, Bret "Hitman" Hart was the perfect example of that hero. He was the technical master, the proud champion, and the man children were supposed to admire. But by 1996, something was changing. The audience was changing. Wrestling was becoming darker, more aggressive, and fans were no longer interested in cheering only the perfect good guys. And then, right in the middle of that change, came a man who seemed to hate everything Bret Hart represented, Steve Austin. Austin wasn't supposed to be the traditional hero. He was rude, violent, selfish, and completely unpredictable. He didn't ask for respect from the audience because he didn't seem to care whether they respected him or not. While Bret Hart represented the values WWE had built its heroes around for decades, Austin represented a new kind of rebellion. And the strange thing was that the more dangerous Austin became, the more the audience started paying attention. WWE was slowly moving away from its old world, but nobody understood yet just how violently that change was about to happen. The first major sign had come in 1996, when Austin delivered the famous Austin 3:16 speech after winning the King of the Ring tournament. The promo gave him an identity, but Steve Austin was still not the unstoppable global superstar he would later become. He had found his voice, but he still needed the rivalry that would transform him from a dangerous character into the biggest force in professional wrestling. And strangely enough, the man who would help create Stone Cold's greatest rise was the very symbol of everything Austin was trying to destroy: Bret Hart. Bret, meanwhile, was dealing with a WWE that no longer felt completely familiar. The fans who had once cheered traditional heroes without question were beginning to react differently. Characters who broke rules were receiving louder reactions, while the clean-cut heroes were no longer automatically loved. Bret Hart had spent years building his reputation on excellence, discipline, and respect. He believed in the traditions of professional wrestling, but as the industry changed around him, Bret was beginning to discover something uncomfortable. Sometimes doing everything the right way was no longer enough to make the fans stay on your side, and that is where the collision between Bret Hart and Steve Austin became much bigger than a normal rivalry. Austin saw Bret as a symbol of the old order. Bret saw Austin as everything that was wrong with the direction WWE was heading. One man represented rebellion, while the other represented tradition. But as their conflict continued, the audience began doing something nobody could fully control. They started choosing sides in a way that completely changed the story. The supposed villain was becoming more popular, while the supposed hero was slowly beginning to lose the emotional connection he had once taken for granted. Their rivalry intensified through late 1996 and early 1997, with Austin constantly targeting Bret Hart and making it clear that he wanted to prove he belonged at the top. Austin didn't care about Bret's reputation, his championships, or the respect he had earned over the years. In fact, that respect was exactly what seemed to make Austin want to attack him even more. Bret was one of WWE's most respected performers, and Austin understood that defeating a man like Bret Hart would mean more than simply winning another match. It would mean tearing down one of the final symbols of the old WWE, but then the story began to change in an unexpected direction. Every time Austin attacked Bret, insulted him, or crossed another line, the audience didn't always respond with the hatred WWE traditionally expected. Instead, many fans were becoming fascinated by Austin's refusal to follow the rules. His aggression felt different from the villains of the past. Austin didn't act like a cartoon bad guy trying to entertain the audience. He felt angry, frustrated, and real. And as the cheers became louder, Bret Hart was forced to face a question that would slowly destroy his relationship with the fans. Why were they supporting this man? That frustration became even more powerful at the 1997 Royal Rumble. Bret Hart believed he had earned his opportunity, only for controversy surrounding Austin's elimination and return to create chaos in the match. Bret was eventually eliminated, and instead of accepting the situation quietly, his anger exploded. This was an important moment because the audience was beginning to see a different side of the Hitman. The calm, controlled, honorable Bret Hart was starting to disappear. He believed he had been treated unfairly, and from his perspective, his anger made complete sense. But that was the problem. Bret believed he was still the victim, while many fans were beginning to see him differently. The more Bret complained about injustice, the more Austin's rebellion seemed attractive. The roles were becoming blurred. Bret still considered himself a hero, but heroes were supposed to rise above their problems. Austin, on the other hand, made no attempt to pretend he was perfect. He was angry and violent, and he openly embraced it. The audience was starting to connect with that honesty, while Bret's frustration was beginning to sound less like righteousness and more like bitterness. As WrestleMania 13 approached, their conflict became the perfect representation of WWE's changing identity. Bret Hart wanted a submission match, a contest where the winner would prove superiority through skill and endurance. It was the kind of match that suited everything Bret believed about wrestling. There would be no easy escape and no lucky finish. Somebody would have to force the other man to submit. On paper, Bret Hart should have been the clear favorite. The Sharpshooter was one of the most feared submission holds in WWE, and Bret was one of the greatest technical wrestlers in the world, but Austin was never interested in doing things the traditional way. He entered WrestleMania 13 as the villain, yet something strange was already happening before the match had even begun. The audience reaction was shifting. The more Austin fought against Bret, the more people wanted to see how far he could go. Bret was still presented as the hero, but the crowd was no longer willing to follow the script in the traditional way. Without realizing it, WWE was walking toward one of the most important character transformations in wrestling history. Then WrestleMania 13 arrived, and everything that had been building for months finally exploded. The match wasn't designed to be a simple battle between good and evil. It became brutal, physical, and increasingly desperate. Bret used his technical ability to control Austin, while Austin fought back with pure determination and violence. Every moment pushed both men closer to their limits, and as the punishment continued, the audience could feel that something unusual was happening. The supposed bad guy was refusing to break, while the supposed hero was becoming more ruthless in his determination to win. Then came the moment that changed everything. Austin was bleeding heavily, his face covered in blood, while Bret Hart applied the Sharpshooter. It was supposed to be the final image of Bret Hart's victory. Instead, it became the image that created a legend. Austin refused to submit. The pain continued. The blood continued to pour, but he would not quit. Eventually, his body gave up before his spirit did, and Steve Austin lost consciousness rather than tapping out. Bret Hart won the match. Officially, there was no argument about that. The referee awarded him the victory because Austin could no longer continue. But in the eyes of the audience, something much more important had happened. Austin had lost the contest, yet he had proven exactly who he was. He had shown the world that he could be beaten, but he could not be broken. That distinction became the foundation of the stone-cold character. He didn't need to win every battle to look dangerous. Sometimes losing while refusing to surrender could make him even stronger. And this is where the double turn became legendary. Instead of simply celebrating his victory, Bret Hart continued attacking Austin after the match. The hero had won, but he wasn't acting like a hero anymore. Austin was lying helpless and exhausted, yet Bret's frustration continued. Suddenly, the audience's emotions became impossible to ignore. The man who had entered as the villain was receiving admiration, while the man who had entered as the hero was being viewed with growing hostility. It was one of the rare moments in wrestling where the audience didn't simply follow a planned label. The fans themselves helped force the transformation. Austin became the anti-hero they wanted to support, not because he suddenly became a nice person, but because he refused to surrender. Bret became increasingly bitter, not because he believed he was evil, but because he genuinely felt the world was turning against him. That made the change far more interesting than a simple good guy versus bad guy switch. Both men believed they were right. From that moment, Steve Austin's rise accelerated. WrestleMania 13 had given him something that couldn't be created through a championship victory alone: absolute credibility. Fans had watched him suffer, bleed, and pass out without giving up. The image became inseparable from his character. Austin was now more than a rebellious wrestler with a famous catchphrase. He had proven that his attitude existed inside the ring as well. If someone wanted to defeat Stone Cold, they would have to do far more than simply hurt him. But while Austin was rising, Bret Hart was moving in the opposite direction. The man who had once been WWE's model hero was becoming more aggressive and more openly frustrated with the American fans who had turned against him. And instead of pretending that the audience hadn't changed, Bret's character began reacting to it. In the United States, he became increasingly hostile, while in Canada and other places he continued to receive strong support. This created one of the most fascinating character situations WWE had ever produced. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because the year that began with Bret Hart defeating Steve Austin at WrestleMania would eventually end with one of the most controversial moments in wrestling history. Bret's relationship with WWE became increasingly tense as contract issues and creative disagreements created uncertainty about his future. Eventually, the situation centered around the WWF Championship and the question of what would happen when Bret was scheduled to leave the company. The destination was Survivor Series 1997 in Montreal. Bret Hart was facing Shawn Michaels, and the atmosphere surrounding the match was already filled with real-life tension. What happened next became known forever as the Montreal Screwjob. Bret was caught in the Sharpshooter, his own signature hold, and the match was suddenly called in a finish Bret had not agreed to. Shawn Michaels was declared the winner, and Bret Hart's final chapter in WWE ended in controversy and anger. And when you look back at the entire year, WrestleMania 13 feels even more important. In March, Bret Hart had forced Steve Austin into unconsciousness using the Sharpshooter. Months later, Bret himself would become trapped in a situation involving that same hold, but this time the controversy would follow him out of WWE. The symbolism is almost impossible to ignore. The man who entered 1997 as one of wrestling's greatest traditional heroes was leaving WWE before the year ended, after one of the most infamous betrayals in its history. Meanwhile, Steve Austin was moving toward a completely different destiny. The momentum created by his performance against Bret Hart continued to grow, and his conflict with authority would eventually become one of the defining stories of the Attitude Era. Austin's rise helped push WWE toward a new generation, one built around anti-heroes, rebellion, and a much more aggressive style of storytelling. The traditional formula was no longer enough. WWE had changed, and Austin became one of the faces of that transformation. That is what makes Bret Hart versus Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13 so much bigger than one bloody submission match. It wasn't simply a match where two legends created an unforgettable moment. It was a collision between two eras. Bret Hart represented a world where the hero was supposed to be honorable and respected. Steve Austin represented the new world, where the hero could be angry, rebellious, and completely unwilling to follow anyone's rules. And perhaps the most incredible part is that Austin didn't even win. On paper, the record books say Bret Hart defeated Steve Austin, but history remembers something more complicated. Bret won the match while Austin won the audience. Bret left WrestleMania as the victor, but Austin left with a level of momentum that would change his career forever. One man had his hand raised. The other man had created an image that wrestling fans would remember for decades. From there, their paths continued in opposite directions. Austin became the anti-hero who helped define an entire era, while Bret's journey through 1997 became increasingly bitter, complicated, and ultimately tragic in its WWE ending. The rise of the Hart Foundation, the USA versus Canada war, the backstage tension, and finally the Montreal Screwjob all became part of the larger story that followed the transformation at WrestleMania 13. So when people talk about the greatest matches in WWE history, they often remember the blood, the Sharpshooter, and Steve Austin refusing to quit. But the real story is even bigger than that. WrestleMania 13 did not just create an iconic moment. It marked the decline of the traditional wrestling hero and the arrival of a new kind of superstar. It changed how fans reacted to good guys and bad guys. It transformed Bret Hart and Steve Austin at the same time. Steve Austin lost that night, but he emerged stronger than ever. Bret Hart won that night, but the victory became another step in the transformation that eventually led him toward the most controversial ending of his WWE career. And somewhere between Austin refusing to tap out and Bret refusing to let go, professional wrestling changed forever. WrestleMania 13 wasn't just Bret Hart versus Steve Austin. It was the moment the old WWE began to disappear, and the Attitude Era started fighting its way to the surface.